Welcome to the inaugural debate of our new digital debate series, co-hosted by First Lutheran Church and Theology by the Pint. My name is Sarah Stone Ulrich. I'm the Executive Director of Theology by the Pint, and tonight I'm going to be your host and moderator. You know, if you have topics you'd like to hear debated in the future, let us know. We want to know. You can reach us through First Lutheran's website, which is flhouston.org, or at Theology by the Pint's website, theologybythepint.org, and we'll remind you of those again at the end of the evening. But in the next 2 hours, we're going to be tackling the question, should Christians support the death penalty? I know, we're starting on a cheery one, but this is going to be good. To do that, we're going to hear from Evan McClanahan first, since he'll be speaking in the affirmative. So a little bit about Evan. Evan McClanahan has been the pastor of First Lutheran Church in Houston for over 16 years. He earned a bachelor's in music in 2001. You should ask him sometime to play the mountain dulcimer for you. And a Master of Divinity in 2007. He's married to the amazing Amanda, and they have 2 children. He didn't put amazing Amanda in his bio, but I really like her, so I added that. Taking the negative position for our question tonight is Matthew Tyson. Matthew Tyson is a public school teacher, Catholic catechist, and freelance journalist whose work often explores the intersection of faith, justice, and civic life, with a particular focus on social justice and moral responsibility. Matthew is also a husband of 15 years, the father of 5 children, and he enjoys spending time outdoors fishing, hiking, and running. I think we're going to have a great conversation tonight. Each speaker is going to have 12 minutes to make their opening case with their opening remarks. Then we'll have formal rebuttals, followed by some cross-examination and closing remarks. And then, of course, my favorite part, which is the Q&A. And again, in the future, if you guys have questions, send those in ahead of time and we'll make sure to get them asked. So if we don't have any questions about any of the format, let's go ahead and just get started. Sound good, guys?
Great.
All right.
Sounds
well, Evan,
good.
I've got my clock ready. You have the floor.
All right. All right, here we go. In his general orders from August the 3rd, 1776, a month after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, General George Washington warned his soldiers of the perils of desertion. He wrote, "It is the general's express orders that if any man attempt to skulk, lay down, or retreat without orders, he be instantly shot down as an example. He hopes no such scoundrel will be found in this army." Throughout the Revolutionary War, General Washington indeed oversaw the execution of many soldiers by hanging or firing squad. These executions brought him no joy, and he pardoned many who had been given the death sentence if they expressed remorse for their crimes. But for the crimes of desertion, pillaging, or treason, the father of our nation had no qualms about using the death penalty as a tool of justice and to deter insubordination. Note that these death penalty sentences were not handed out for the crimes of murder or rape or kidnapping, 3 crimes for which the Bible explicitly endorses the death penalty. But even if a hungry soldier left his camp, went into town, and pillaged food from a private citizen, Washington authorized that such a soldier could and should be shot on the spot. While such penalties may seem harsh, they serve as a useful demonstration of how lenient our society has become towards crime. Every day we see pillaging in our cities, and we know that if the perpetrators are caught, they will face nothing close to the death penalty. Rapists and murderers routinely get less than a decade in prison, if not an even lighter slap on the wrist. And a case can be made that kidnapping, now called human trafficking, is virtually ignored by our government. Millions of Americans are disillusioned and demoralized as we become aware of the gap between the law and order that, say, General Washington embodied, and the willful, even encouraged, allowance of crime in our own day. What has changed is simple. There has been a transfer of sympathy from the victim to the criminal. The criminal's rights have become more sacrosanct than the rights of the victim to live in a reliably and predictably safe and secure country. Yes, of course, crime and immoral acts took place in the past, and yes, some of it was also approved of by the government, like slavery. Yes, there are many reasons that criminals become criminals, and there are certainly extenuating circumstances surrounding many crimes that might lessen or alleviate the requirement of prison or death as a punishment. But even in my own lifetime, dramatic leniency towards crime has become normalized, and such leniency seems to dovetail with America's weakened Christian confidence and voice. For example, A man who was found guilty of killing 15 people in Wisconsin in 1992 was not given the death penalty, but merely 15 back-to-back life sentences. Yes, even the most notorious serial killer in American history, Jeffrey Dahmer, did not receive the death penalty for his crimes in modern America. Such examples of men and women who committed equally abhorrent crimes and received similarly light sentences can easily be found. But I don't want to merely address modern complaints about our lack of law and order. The question for us is, should Christians endorse the death penalty? So, we need to know what the Bible and good theology have to say about the matter. So the short answer is yes. And until about, a few years ago, it seems, the vast majority of all Christians, including all of the official teachings of the Catholic Church until 2018, supported and defended the state's right to execute criminals who committed heinous crimes. Yes, mercy is a wonderful thing and can be offered in some cases. Yes, any justice system will get it wrong from time to time, and efforts to avoid such injustices should be, of course, undertaken. But it is an indisputable fact of this debate that God himself is a supporter of the death penalty. Over 30 crimes in the Old Testament, including rape, bestiality, incest, idolatry, necromancy, blasphemy, kidnapping, offering false witness, and murder, were all said by God to be worthy of the death penalty. And these are the kinds of crimes that we might even find agreeable, right, even in the modern age, that deserve the same. There are many more crimes that we would rather not even discuss that God also says are worthy of death, like adultery, or negligent homicide, or cursing, or striking one's parents. Now, surely some of these laws can be safely relegated to the Old Testament because they only apply to the promised land of Israel, or the covenant Hebrew people, or a sacrificial system that was fulfilled by Christ. But just as sure, it seems to me, God's moral laws and some civil laws carry into our own day. How could they not? Since they communicate God's unchanging nature and will. If God is unchanging, then why would his view on murder or rape change? And if God's views on rape and murder do not change, why would his prescriptions for their just punishments? You could put it in the form of a syllogism. 1, God does not change. 2, therefore God's declarations of what are good and bad and their benefits and penalties also do not change. 3, God has made declarations through his moral law. 4, therefore God's moral law and their benefits and penalties can never change. Well, but maybe Jesus changed everything. He would, of course, after all, be the one human who could override Old Testament law. And he did say that he who is without sin should throw the first stone in the case of the woman caught with adultery. The questionable nature of that text and the hypocrisies it served to demonstrate aside, Jesus also said this in Matthew 5:17 and 18. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Now, some will say that this is Jesus' way of saying that upon his perfect obedience to the law, all of the law will lose its continual relevance for his followers. But why would we think that just because Jesus fulfills the law, it is no longer in effect? Yes, I believe Jesus is our perfect substitute, that he did obey all of the law perfectly, and in that way he did fulfill it as a penal substitute that we would need to fulfill it. But that doesn't make the law disappear. Christians have always believed that. At least the moral commandments of God, if not the civil, remain in effect and would make sense that given their penalties would as well. So, for example, the 10 Commandments, we would say, are surely still applicable. Even if the law can no longer forensically declare that a Christian is guilty, as Luther said he believed, he still thought that murder was wrong and it merited the death penalty. Furthermore, in the New Testament, we do not see God seeming particularly bothered by the deaths, for example, of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5. Did they even commit murder? No. They just lied to the church about how much profit they made off the sale of a property. And for their crime, God cuts them down in the prime of life without so much as a jury or a judge. Paul writes in Romans 13, "But if you do wrong, be afraid, for the ruler does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." I suppose this sword could be a metaphor for justice in general, but I don't think so. It would be anachronistic to suggest that Paul was not well aware of those in offense and how they used the death penalty all the time, and he seemed to say it was good. In Genesis 9, after the flood, when only 8 people on earth were alive, God said to Noah, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." This is pre-Mosaic covenant language, so that it cannot be said that it is wiped away with Jesus' fulfillment of the Mosaic law. I will agree that we do not have the same clarity on the death penalty in the New Testament as we do in the Old. There is some silence on this question for several reasons, not least of which is that New Testament Christians had no power to enact law for 300 years. Even the Jews had to ask the Romans to execute Jesus on their behalf, as they had no authority to carry out their own law. The same was true for Christians who lived under the auspices of Rome for centuries. Also, it seems highly likely to me that obvious laws that everyone agreed with did not need repeating. We have seen the same issue, for example, with homosexuality. People will say, well, if Jesus opposed homosexuality, why didn't he just say so? Well, he did, first of all. But second of all, no one was going around arguing for it, and no one would for centuries. So silence in the New Testament is not evidence that New Testament Christians rejected the death penalty. If anything, the New Testament is silent because they simply assumed that it would be continually used. So I want to conclude by offering here 2 classic defenses of the death penalty. For even though I do think this is ultimately a question of biblical authority, the case can be made logically and ethically for the death penalty as well. First, Christians should defend the death penalty because it is just. The severe violation of the social contract that murder, rape, and other acts of violence simply are demand, for the sake of past and future victims, the death penalty. Refusing the death penalty favors the criminal more than the victim by offering them the precious gift of life, while those that were taken, they have lost that precious gift of life. And refusing to honor that sense of justice simply leads to more cynicism and a loss of morale in any society. Second, if it is used rightly, the death penalty is a deterrent. Now, I will agree that the way it is currently used, where someone who is condemned to death might live on death row for 25 or 30 years, is not much of a deterrent. I suspect that is by design. Nor does the infrequency of the death penalty as we allow criminals to plea out of it. But I can assure you that the soldiers under Washington's command thought twice and 3 times about pillaging at Valley Forge. Third, it is morally unjust for law-abiders to keep those who violated the social contract in such an egregious manner alive indefinitely via tax collection. The murderer or rapist who is kept alive indefinitely in prison is further victimizing polite society simply by staying alive. Finally, the convicted criminal can never again perpetuate more crimes by early release or escape or while in prison. I hope we'll have time to talk as well about the categories of justice and salvation, for I do affirm that one who receives the death penalty can and should have the opportunity to receive Jesus and save his or her soul. I do affirm that all people are made in the image of God and the right to life is sacrosanct. What we will need then today is opportunity for categorical correctness on ethical questions such as this. Thanks very much.
All right. 26 seconds to spare. Nice job. Matthew, that does not mean you get extra 26 seconds. All right. Matthew, you're up.
Thank you. As we've said, the question in hand is, should Christians support the death penalty? It is my position that both from a pragmatic and spiritual perspective, and especially in light of the gospel message and the model set forth to us by Jesus himself, no follower of Christ should support the use of the death penalty, especially in modern times. I'll begin with the spiritual. What God desires of his creation is unity and communion. God loves us. He wishes to be united with us, for us to conform to his will and live in union with him for eternity. As Timothy reminds us, God our Savior wills that all mankind be saved. And this is only made possible through Jesus Christ. When we accept him, We attain not just eternal life after death, but new life in this world. And we are shown, both through Christ's actions and his directives, how we are to live this new life. As his followers, we must walk like Jesus. We must love like Jesus, care like Jesus, and in all things be like Jesus. And thankfully, he provides us with a model for doing so. And it is a model clearly rooted in the divine concepts of mercy, love, forgiveness, charity, and humility. So if we shape our lives and our actions according to Christ's model, then there is no place in this new life where the death penalty fits. If we love like Christ, then we desire the same thing for all mankind that he desires for us: redemption. Both our heart and our will must be ordered towards the salvation of all. Now, consider how this new approach to life applies to the question of the death penalty. Consider first that prisoners on death row are in a unique situation. For one, they are desperately in need of the redeeming power of the gospel. Furthermore, the prisoner on death row is captured and isolated. They no longer pose any threat to the public. So we have to ask ourselves, at this moment, when we have someone who is not only in need of redemption, but whose threat to innocent life has been neutralized via imprisonment, what would Jesus do? If we look to the Gospels, I think that we see it plainly. We have to start with love. We look at the person with love, a difficult thing to do, I admit. But we must look upon this sinner just as Jesus in the Gospel of Mark looks at the rich man who was resistant to giving up his possessions. We must look at the prisoner the way that the Father does. We must forgive. This is non-negotiable for the Christian. Jesus tells Peter in Matthew 18 to forgive not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Why? Because we have also been forgiven. And we risk eternal punishment if we withhold from others what God has freely given to us. We show mercy. We do not repay violence with violence. We do not take life for life. We do not trade eye for eye, just as Jesus explicitly tells us in Matthew chapter 5. We all know it. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist one who is evil. And then, after we love and after we forgive and after we show mercy, we try our best to clear the path to redemption instead of condemnation, just as Jesus does in John's gospel for the woman caught in adultery, a woman who was by law to be put to death. Jesus spares her with his command, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, and then after saving her from this fate, tells her to sin no more, saves her from death, and she is redeemed. So the model set forth for us by Christ shows us a path out of the cycle of violence. It shows us a way to respond to the fallen world with love and the hope of redemption. Rather than demanding retribution, we seek to heal and restore. This is part of the job as disciples of Christ. We often talk about the death penalty as justice, but true justice in the light of Christ is not retributive, but restorative. We do not pay back pain for pain. Instead, we set right what is broken. We restore what is lost. We heal. And let me be very clear, at its very core, the death penalty is an act of retribution. It is blood for blood. It is eye for eye. You killed, so now we will kill you. And this is just simply not what Christ commands of us. Who is restored through the death penalty? Who is redeemed through capital punishment? The answer is nobody. But through Christ, through love, and through mercy, we find these things. If we take the life of the prisoner on death row, we erase every opportunity to live like Christ. We choose retribution over redemption. We choose wrath over mercy. We take away the hope of salvation for another. Furthermore, the prisoner on death row presents to us, in fact, one of the greater challenges of Christian living, to look at someone who has so heinously rejected the gift and dignity of life and see Christ, to see what God sees, a soul that is lost, but still loved and still worthy of salvation. So why would we turn away from this? As I shift towards a more pragmatic opposition to the death penalty, I have another question to propose as a sort of bridge here, and it's one that Christians have to consider carefully. If we, as followers of Christ, who take the gospel seriously, find ourselves in a situation where we do not have to shed blood, especially in order to protect life, what reason do we have to do so? If the Christian does not have to kill, why should we? I can accept that at one point in human history, the death penalty, while always terrible, had a place in the protection of society. If society could not protect the innocent from an unjust aggressor, recourse to the death penalty was recognized as justified. But in the modern context, this is no longer the case. We have at our disposal maximum security prisons, methods, and resources that allow us to both keep a violent criminal away from society, while also respecting and protecting the inherent dignity and value of that criminal's life, which a dignity that, despite their sins, comes from God and is impossible to remove. We have the ability to end the cycle of bloodshed while also protecting the rest of society. So again, if we are inspired by the model and life of Christ, why would we choose to take the life of the criminal when there is no need to do so? Now, on a much more pragmatic level, the death penalty is rife with contradictions. For one, it's not an effective deterrent against murder. Those intent on killing are going to do so, and those who do not wish to take life are not going to do so. The death penalty has never acted as a proper deterrent against murder in all of human history and society. More importantly, historically, recourse to the death penalty has been rife with errors. If we are going to insist that the death penalty is a necessary form of justice, then I think we would all agree that we need to be 100% sure before we take someone's life. And unfortunately, this has not been the case. To begin, there have been over 200 exonerations from death row since the 1970s. These are people who were convicted and sentenced to death by the state only to be released decades later. That's an exceptionally close call. Beyond that, we have documented cases of people who have been wrongfully executed, or at least have been executed based on shaky evidence, where great doubt remains as to the truth of the case. And I don't think it's in any way hyperbolic to suggest that even one innocent life taken by the death penalty is a monstrous evil, and one that negates the very concept of justice to begin with. We simply cannot say with perfect conviction that we can apply the death penalty without error. And because of this, we run the risk of great and significant sin. This is why the power of life and death should be in God's hands alone. We have limited understanding. We have bias. We are imperfect. This is not the case for God. As Christians, we should humbly accept our inadequacies and fallacies and instead focus our energies on being salt and light in the hope of salvation. So, in concluding my opening statement, I argue that if we as Christians are truly transformed by the saving power of his blood, if we conform our will to his, if we model our lives off of Christ's example, and if we love the way that Christ first loved us, then I see no reason for the Christian to support the death penalty. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. You guys are both pithy. I like it. Evan, are you ready for a rebuttal?
I am, I guess. Ready as I'll ever be.
All right. Well, go for it.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to I appreciate Matthew's, tone, his spirit. He's a compassionate guy. And, I very much appreciate that. It's kind of a shame I have to be on the side of death, but, yeah, so someone's got to do it, I guess. So a couple of thoughts. He said, for example, that God desires unity and communion. Well, I agree. But crime breaks that. Vicious, horrible crimes, stealing the innocence of people, it breaks that, it violates that. So there's always has to be a question of, well, what do we do when such unity or communion is broken? Unity around what exactly? I don't think taking the death penalty off the table affects the unity that we can still achieve. He says we must love like Jesus. Well, yeah, I agree. How do we show love to our neighbor, though? Because again, my main thesis is that we have drifted towards basically more compassion for the criminal than for the victim. And so my neighbor is also the victim of crime. And I think that the innocent victim of crime should get more of a say than the perpetrator of the crime. So we show love to our neighbor by punishing criminals in such a way that it is a deterrent to people who might future victimize other people. So I think that is how I'm showing love toward my neighbor. He says, we want redemption and the salvation of all. Agreed. But we also want justice. So, we have to balance all of these things out. I mean, there are people who choose to perpetuate evil because they like it, because they're influenced by the devil, or because they love the flesh, or whatever reason. They're fallen in sin. And so, yes, I want the salvation of everybody, but the fact is I live in a fallen world and I also want justice. And so we have to balance those things out. He says that people on death row no longer pose a threat to the public. Well, but they get to live and the victim does not. And so I think that, yes, while they may not pose a future threat, although that's not always the case either, because there have been lots of people who have been convicted of life sentences and then they get out of jail. People get out all the time for good behavior. There was a famous case. I could just go on and on with examples. I won't do it. But there was a guy recently killed a small child. I think this was in North Carolina. He got out of jail after 7 or 10 years. And so this sort of thing happens all the time. People are arrested every single day in this country. There was someone who's lit on fire in Chicago recently, and the person who did it was arrested over 100 times. So anyway, so I think that it's not just that they don't pose a danger to the public in the future. It's that it's unjust for them to enjoy the fruits of life while they have taken the life of someone else. I think that's what Genesis 9 is saying. He says, forgive 70 times 7. Yes, I agree. Forgiveness and justice. That you can have both. It's not an either or. You can't. We don't have to choose between offering a chaplain to someone on death row and saying, do you want to give your life to Jesus? Do you want to receive the forgiveness of sins? Do you want to go to heaven when you die? I'm all for that. But that doesn't mean they still don't face a penalty for their sin. And that penalty might be the death penalty. So he says, we do not repay violence for violence. Well, yes, we do. I mean, even prison is a form of violence. Violence is inescapable. The use of force is inescapable in any civilized society because there are always going to be people who sin, who do evil, and it must be punished after the fact, and it should be prevented ahead of time. So merely arresting someone will simply be by its nature the force of violence. Prison is violence. So we do. It's just a question of which violence. It's perfectly fine to say I stop short at the death penalty, but the fact is we do repay violence with some form of violence. How much time do I have?
You have 2 minutes, just under 2 minutes.
Okay. The bridge question was, if we as followers of Jesus don't have to kill, then why should we? Well, I'll propose a very simple answer, which is because God said so. I think what has happened is that we basically think that we know better than God. At this point, I think that we basically, look at the law of God, which, as I said, I think continues. The moral law of God continues into the present day. I don't think it ceased, and therefore I don't think their penalties cease either. Now, why? We'll hopefully talk later about where you draw the line, perhaps. But if the law hasn't ceased and the penalties haven't ceased, then who are we to say to God, well, we appreciate the suggestion and everything, but we just don't think we should. That's a death penalty offense anymore, so we just won't do that. So why kill if we don't have to? Well, because Jesus said so. But I also think that what we've seen is the diminution of the clarity of God saying certain things in his law, and then that's led to the diminution of persecuting all kinds of crime, all down the line. When we don't treat murder for what it is such a horrible thing that it is, then that becomes a real problem. Not a deterrent. Well, as I said, I guarantee you that no soldiers at Valley Forge went pillaging into town when they were hungry in the winter of 1777, because the threat of execution on the spot was very real, and people saw it with their own eyes. So I think that it's not a deterrent. It won't always be a deterrent for some people, but it definitely would be a deterrent for certain people, just like speeding tickets are a deterrent for us to drive how we want. It's just that we carry it out so poorly. And I think less than 1% of all the crimes in America that could get the death penalty do, because we allow criminals to plead out of them all the time. And so I don't think we should allow people to plead. If somebody confesses to a murder, why do they still not get the death penalty? It makes no sense. They should definitely be getting the death penalty in that situation.
All
And then
right,
rife with errors. Am I out?
You are.
Last point, and then
Sure.
I'll give him a few seconds if I could.
Yeah.
Rife with errors. Yeah, well, we also imprison people falsely, but we still imprison people. So, granted, death is more serious than just imprisonment, but even God knew that it wasn't going to be a perfect system. So,
Okay, Matthew, you have to do your rebuttal, but also remember all of this for cross. So best of luck.
I'll do the best.
Yeah.
I would say first, you say that crime breaks unity and communion, and it does, but it can also be restored, and that's the whole purpose of the prodigal son. We can always find our way back to him. And when I talk about unity and communion with Christ, we mean not just here on earth, but in eternity. Like I said, the goal that we're looking at here is salvation and redemption of all things. We aren't talking about taking a life. We aren't talking about killing somebody. And I would remind us that the whole concept of death was never really meant for humans in the first place. Through Christ, we find an escape from death. I often say, as Christians, we shouldn't be in the business of death. We're in the business of eternal life. We can punish, we can protect society without having to kill them. I think there are certain levels to things here. Having to use a little excessive force or any force at all to arrest somebody is not the same as taking their life. We live in a world where violence is repaid with violence, and it doesn't fix a thing. If this type of response, response to violence was, let's use violence, let's kill them back, I feel like we would see things getting better, and we don't. I feel like we would see we would see a change, and we don't. We do see a change, however, in the person when they accept Christ. We do see a path out of violence when they accept Christ. We do see people turning away from the sins that lead them to all these horrible things through Christ. And so, again, I think that our primary focus should be on bringing people towards redemption, not taking their life. The lack of law and order, the leniency towards crime, I mean, just on a pragmatic level, crime statistics have been in a massive decline over the past 30 years. So, I mean, we're not living in some sort of, outrageous, barbaric world here where we've gotten lenient on crime and things have been getting worse. As a matter of fact, violent crime across the board has been reducing. The argument about killing people for deserting, killing people for other crimes that aren't violent, I struggle with that tremendously because, I mean, yes, I'm sure that it did work for certain soldiers in Washington's army, but at the same time, I think that any time that somebody doesn't do something wrong just simply because they're afraid of the punishment isn't the true kind of contrition and turning towards God that we're looking for. Losing my train of thought here. Going to the issue of say like Genesis 9:6, God does. I mean, I'm not denying the fact that those are the words that are said, but I find it to be highly restrictive, a highly restrictive interpretation that Genesis 9:6 absolutely demands that Christians now support capital punishment. Who is the man that is to shed the blood? What man? What authority? There's no instruction, no indication there on who, what, when, or where this blood is supposed to be shed. And so I think we have to be very careful there, especially in the light of everything that we see from Christ. And yes, it does come before the Mosaic law, but it's still Old Covenant. And Jesus does not change things; he does fulfill things. This is lose my train of thought. There we go. It is also like the blood for blood is the exact same structure as eye for an eye, which Jesus himself tells us again explicitly. We don't do that. We also when we don't use violence to try and heal the violence in the world. If unity is broken, we don't break it down further. We try to heal it. We don't heal by killing. That continues the cycle. We heal through showing Christ to others. And yes, it does seem like, and it can seem to some people, that perhaps allowing the criminal to live when someone else has died is being too lenient. But I disagree with that point as well. I would argue that, for starters, we are actually respecting the image of God by choosing not to kill the criminal, because that criminal is also made in the image of God. So we don't lower ourselves to that same level of violence in choosing to kill them just because they have also killed. Again, as I said earlier, yes, justice. We need justice, but Christ's justice is not retributive. It is restorative. True justice is to see all people, all men, turn away from their violence, turn away from their sins, and to accept Christ. How am I doing on time now?
Oh, you've got just over a minute.
Also, I would say that going back to about Washington, just one real quick thing. Washington is not the guy that I get my moral compass from. It's Jesus Christ. I mean, like, he did do those things, but I would have to say that if the choice is between the peace and love and mercy that Christ gives us and then Washington's desire to kill his soldiers just simply because they went into town and stole some food, I'm going to side with Jesus on this one. That's just kind of the direction I think we should go here. I'll save the rest for our cross-examination and discussion.
Sure, fair enough. Okay, well, thanks, guys. We are finished with our rebuttals. All right, we're going to go into the cross-examination. So, Evan, I'm going to put 10 minutes on the clock for you to pepper Matthew with rapid-fire questions. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right, go.
Okay, Matthew, I think I know the answer to this, but do you regard the Bible as the Word of God?
Of course.
Okay. And do you regard the Bible as a unified whole, like Old and New Testament?
Yes.
Okay. And is the God of the Old Testament the same God that you worship and that all Trinitarians worship?
Yes.
Okay. Does the God of the Old Testament approve of the death penalty?
Yes. It is said to be used. It is commanded to be used, yes.
Okay. And so, therefore, do we worship a God who approves of the death penalty?
I want to say, or my response to this is that we have to I think I would say that when we read when we read the scriptures as a whole, that we have to do so very carefully. I would say that in all things, in old, new, everything, that we have to read the gospel, we have to read the entire scriptures in the light of the gospel, because that's what we as Christians do. We have to consider, because of the cross, we have to reconsider everything in light of Christ's perfect sacrifice. I would argue that when God tells us that he allows certain things or chooses certain things or does certain things in the Old Testament, he says there are many things out of the hardness of your heart. I think that God talks to people at a certain time in a certain way. I think that God chose to become incarnate at a certain time for a certain reason. I believe that revelation is shown to us progressively. There is all this history prior to the incarnation that has to be considered. So what I would say is that God does not change. You mentioned, you came that earlier. God does not change, but we do change. And as we change, we come to understand his will on a greater level. And so when I think that when Christ comes again, that's why, I could ask the same question of do we serve a God that approves of divorce or of slavery or of anything else? When we see Christ tells us it was out of the hardness of your hearts. Before Christ, we have a bit of a different world. We have people who respond to God differently, and God meets us where we are. Did God allow for the use of death penalty at one point in time in history? Yeah. Of course he did. To say no would be to deny the scripture. Now, we could get into lots of conversations about biblical scholarship and reading the Old Testament and the New Testament, things of that nature.
Okay, well, we'll get there. We'll get there.
But
okay, well, let me keep going.
Yeah.
Okay, so did the apostles approve of the death penalty?
Can you be more specific in what you're referencing?
Well, did Paul approve of the death penalty, for example?
So I'm assuming you're talking about Romans 13 when he talks about the.
Yeah, I mean it's not a trick question. I mean, like I'm just genuine. Like, do you think, like as you read the Bible, do you think that as the apostles went through life and what we know from their readings, do you think that if there was a criminal who committed murder, that they would have said he should be executed?
I can't speculate about what they would have said in that moment, but I can tell you that I do think that Paul is one of our apostles that very specifically mentions the authority of the state, and I would say that when Paul talks about the state wielding the sword, he is recognizing a reality of the world, not necessarily endorsing its use.
Okay. Did God execute the death penalty when Ananias and Sapphira died?
Yeah, but that was God, not us.
Okay, that's fine. Does Jesus' death and resurrection bring to an end the application of all Old Testament laws?
Well, we're all Old Testament laws as in a whole, not necessarily.
Okay,
that's fine. That's fine. Commandments, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like the 10 Commandments, for example, you would say still apply.
I would. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
That was yes. Okay. Sorry.
You said I would. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a general rule or a rubric or a hermeneutic for determining which Old Testament laws continue into the New Testament or our current day?
It's a fantastic question. So personally, yeah. I come from the Catholic perspective, and so I have a whole host of teaching and biblical scholarship and study that determines this, and I'm guided by that. What I believe is to be a scriptural authority. Yeah.
So in 2018, my understanding is that the Catholic Catechism changed, right? Or the official teaching of the Catholic Church became against the death penalty. Is that right?
Is the word that we would use.
Okay, developed. Okay. Were you in favor of the death penalty before 2018?
No, I was not.
You're always against it. Okay.
Yes.
I was just curious. Okay. If we don't look for the Bible to determine penalties for crimes, then where should we look?
I think we have to go back to the question that I mentioned earlier, or the question that we all wore on our wrists in the 1990s. What would Jesus do? I am in no way arguing against the existence of consequences. There are consequences for our actions. And so I think through prayer and careful consideration of the model of Christ, and asking ourselves in every situation, like I said, everything that we do, even when I scratch my head, I have to consider it in the light of Christ's perfect sacrifice on the cross. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is good and right here? What is going to lead towards redemption? What is going to promote the common good over all things? What is going to do the most good that we can do? And so, again, in all things, I say we look to the model of Christ. There's nothing wrong with consequences. There's nothing wrong with punishments. God knows my children know that very well. But when it comes to the matter of the death penalty specifically, which again is what we're talking about here, I just don't see it fitting with the Christian outlook.
Okay. Is one of your objections to the death penalty that it prematurely cuts off a person's ability to hear the gospel?
One of my arguments to death penalty is not so much that it might prematurely, maybe, but I think the greater concern is I think that we should allow a person as much time as possible to accept the gospel.
Okay. What is the average length of time that someone is on death row?
I know it's decades and decades.
Well, how much time should we give somebody on death row to hear the gospel before we say that's enough time?
It's not my job to determine that.
Okay. If someone is murdered, is their ability to hear the gospel cut short?
Potentially.
Is that just?
No.
Well, if someone's premature murder means that they have less time to hear the gospel and to be saved, even less time than the murderer who could have decades on death row with visits from a chaplain presenting the gospel, Is there anything less just than that?
Look, I mean, I'm not going to do the same thing to another life that has already been done. I'm not going to repay that sin with another act of violence. I can't control what that person did. I can control what or what I do. If I'm in that position, I can control what I think should happen. And listen, I got to be honest with you. I mean, you want to talk, if this was a family member of mine who was cut down in this situation, would I personally want to see them die? Yeah, I'm an imperfect human. I would want them to suffer. I would want them to feel pain. But the deal here is that what God's law and what God desires is greater than what I want. I'm imperfect. I'm always going to want to commit violence against somebody who has done so. I'm going to always want to look at this and, well, it's not fair that they got killed and this guy doesn't get killed. But I don't believe that is the way of Christ. My job as a Christian is to turn from that fallen nature and to seek something greater, something higher, something more redemptive.
Okay. I think I have time for one more question. Is there an example of any crime or any criminal that you can think of where someone would forsake their right to life? In other words, is there any crime bad enough or any collection of crimes bad enough where you think someone ought to be put to death?
When considering the death penalty, I would say not in our modern time.
Okay.
Okay, Matthew, how badly do you want to put Evan on the hot seat now?
It's okay.
Okay, but it's your turn to try to trap him. I mean, not really trap, but you get it. Go ahead and start whenever you want.
You referenced earlier a lack of law and order, more leniency towards crime. Can you be more specific about what you mean in that respect, like data, homework, things of that nature? Like, what do you mean by that?
Well, think, for example, of the young lady in Charlotte, North Carolina, killed, stabbed in the neck in a way that we all saw, last August. Irina Zaruchka, I believe is her name, the Ukrainian young woman. And her assailant had been arrested 14 times and, never really put away, even though he clearly had problems. His own mother was saying he should be put away. So that would be an example. I use the example of Jeffrey Dahmer. And by the way, I want this to forever be the heads and freezers example, because this was a guy who committed the most heinous acts we could possibly imagine, and even he didn't get the death penalty. So I think if that isn't lenient, I don't know what is. I don't know how much worse you could possibly do than be a serial killer who does that sort of thing to your victims. So, but even at the petty level, you look at like shoplifting becoming a misdemeanor in like San Francisco. Now they've pulled that back by a statewide vote they had I think 2 years ago now. But, you would not be arrested essentially for stealing up to $950. That was reduced to a misdemeanor. So you had people just rampaging stores, taking whatever they want, so that now anytime you go into a pharmacy in CVS, everything is locked up, even your shampoo and deodorant, which if it has aluminum in it, it probably should be locked up. But you get the idea.
You said something earlier. You said that that victimizing polite society simply by being alive. Can you expand on that some more?
Yeah. So I think that I know that was a harsh sentence. And by the way, half of your head is out of the frame. I don't know if you can see it.
I'm in full frame right now.
Now you're all the way, at least on my end anyway. And give him back 10 seconds. But so yeah, I think that, when you commit a heinous enough act, you forsake your right to life. And if we're going to say that a person there has an indefinite right, to life, well, then they can't pay for themselves. They can't provide for themselves. So we have to as taxpayers. And so the cost of that is pretty extraordinary. So I actually do think that polite society continues to be victimized by simply keeping people alive indefinitely. I know that's the harshest thing I'm probably going to say all night, but at some point, I think you lose your right to life because you have so violated the social contract.
Do you not think so? You think that even if we are able, would you say that even if we are able to keep that person away from society, then that you're saying that if they do something so heinous, they absolutely reject their right to life?
I think so.
I'm sorry. Continue.
No. Yes, I think so. I think God says that. Really, I mean, more to the point. I mean, I sometimes think God gives us His law And he knows that we're not going to want to follow the law. I mean, you think, for example, of the children of Aaron, who danced before the altar with the wrong incense. And, God has to put them to death because they violated the law. Or the person who touches the Ark of the Covenant when it's going to fall, or the person who, picks up sticks. These are examples in the Old Testament where people knowingly, willfully violated the law. And I don't want to see any of those people die either. I mean, I don't like death any more than anybody else. But when God says that we do a thing, I think God is well within his rights to say it, and I think he says it for good reasons. So I don't think we get to come along later and say, well, but maybe we can make an exception here, here, and here. I would be willing, for the sake of this argument, to again reduce it to heads and freezers. Okay, so if we only had someone who committed truly heinous and horrible acts where there was no question of their guilt, right? Even if they confess it or something like that, I would be willing for that to be the only crime under consideration, because what I want to do is I want to get people back to really taking the word of God seriously in such a way that when God says we do something, then we do it.
Would you say then that if we don't execute the murder, that we are disobeying God?
Yes, depending on the crime. Now, at some point, we're going to have a threshold conversation around which crimes, in the Old Testament transfer into the New. Like I said, I'd be willing to just, use like someone like Jeffrey Dahmer as an example, as a standard. But at some point, we'd need to kind of work it out from there. I mean, for example, in Florida, they, I believe, have passed and I believe signed into law that a person who greatly harms children, I'll say nicely, gets the death penalty now, even if they don't kill that child. And so I think there is a move in more conservative circles back to the death penalty, even for I won't say capital, but non-death crimes. That makes it like not just murder, for example.
Well, so you would say then that God is not obeyed, God is not appeased if we do not take the life of the murderer.
I believe if God says we should execute murderers, if we have reasonable certainty that they did it, not perfect certainty, because even in the Old Testament, the standard is only 2 witnesses. So I think even God understood that people were made in the image of God, that the standard was 2 witnesses, and God knew that justice was going to be imperfect, and yet he says, this is the death penalty for these crimes. So if God says that, who are we to disobey? Now, you could say, well, what about, the crime of homosexuality? And so I'll mention a book now. I was going to mention it in my closing, but it's called The Bounds of Love by Joel McDermott. And he and Doug Wilson did a debate, which you might be able to find somewhere online. Still, I'm not sure about the question of like homosexuality and the death penalty, because they're both theonomists. Okay. So, but they disagree about using the death penalty for certain crimes. So the question, even within theonomist camps, is, well, where do you draw the line? And so this book is one way of saying there are certain crimes that cause such an offense to the body that they mandate the death penalty, but certain crimes are relegated to the Old Testament. So I would say for the crime of murder, I think kidnapping could probably be on that list. I think rape could probably be on that list. Yeah, I think that to not execute someone at some point is us saying to God, we know better. And what God wants is for innocent people to be protected.
Well, God wants innocent people to be protected. But yeah. I guess the ultimate question I have on that is that if God is disobeyed, or if God is not appeased by us not taking the life of the prisoner, not shedding that blood, then what is Christ's perfect sacrifice for? If there is more bloodshed that needs to happen in order for God's justice to be had, then what does that say about the cross?
Well, I don't think it negates grace in any way, because I think the person on death row, again, now for decades, whereas in the past, even if it was in the wild, wild west, and they were going to be hanged that afternoon or something, I think it was still quite possible that the gospel might have been presented in those situations. It's certainly presented, in our situation. So I think there's just a categorical difference between, salvation and ethics. I think in this fallen world, we have difficult ethical questions to answer. And one of those questions is, what do we do with criminals? How do we protect innocent people? And I'm okay with the gospel being presented to all prisoners, especially to people on death row. I think it is not a contradiction at all to offer them forgiveness and grace and then to execute them, because justice demands that. I think those are two totally different categories.
How much time do we have left on that?
Just under 2 minutes.
Okay.
But you're going to get another round of putting him in the hot seat. So
yeah. I think I'm fine to yield the rest of the time.
Okay. So that's back to you, Evan, to pepper him with questions. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, go.
Okay. I want to visit deterrence more.
Mm-hmm.
That's come up a few times. So if you knew, and granted this is a hypothetical, but if you knew that the death penalty would prevent future victimization, would you support it?
If I knew that the death penalty would prevent future victimization,
right,
would I support it? I don't think so, because I still think that there are other ways to prevent victimization. And at the end of the day, I as a Christian, do not want to continue the cycle of violence. And I think that we have lots of examples of even early Christians, early martyrs, who recognized that that was something they couldn't do anymore and chose to be martyred for it. No, I don't. I don't want to kill anybody, and I don't think the Christian should kill anybody.
Okay. Is there, well, you know what that reminds me, like in fact, I was going to put this in the background, but this is something my mom gave me. It's a list of the 10 Commandments.
Oh.
It was framed, but I dropped the frame and broke the glass before we started. Anyway, but in that it says, "You shall not kill." I'm curious, I have sorry, that was your 10-minute timer. So you had all that time you could have used. But do you people like me will say, well, really it should be translated, "Thou shalt not murder," because there are justified killings, like self-defense, for example. Like even if you take the death penalty off the table, self-defense or warfare, just war. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on whether the word should be murder or kill in the 10 Commandments?
I'll say that in my reading, my scholarship, and the church's reading and scholarship, they recognize it as murder, not just as kill. Because there are, again, we're talking about the death penalty. There are other situations that we could get into regarding that, but or other acts of violence or moments of that where life might be taken. But I do think, though, that there's something to be said about Christ elevating even the 10 Commandments. I mean, he tells us that you've heard it said, "Thou shalt not murder," but talking about if you hatred in your heart, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," but if you even look upon somebody lustfully. So I do think that, I think the original interpretation of murder, I'm not going to argue against that. That is fine. Okay. But I think in the light of Christ, everything is elevated. Everything is not changed, but fulfilled. And so, yeah.
Okay, fair. Going back to deterrence, is there any level, and I think I know the answer, is there any level of deterrence that could bring you to support the death penalty?
I don't think so, because it's not just about the practical effect in society. I think that I believe in the transformative power of Christ above all things. I believe in the life after this one, and so I think that if we can. Humans are amazing. I mean, we really are. Humans can find ways to do things. I believe that a true Christian should, in every sense of the word, do their best to find ways to justice without having to kill. Okay. For me personally, it's just, I'm not. Even with the issue of deterrence, you're still taking another life. You're still opting to choose to kill over the hope of redemption, over the hope of peace, over the hope of salvation. So personally, no.
Okay. Well, I'm going to push it one step further then, which is, if you could push a magic button and support the death penalty for one criminal, and you knew that one execution would eliminate all future murderers, would you support it then?
So in this magical world,
it's magical,
where I have this power, and would prevent all future murders. I'm tempted to respond with that old adage that hard cases make bad law. I mean, that's that. I don't know. To be honest with you, I couldn't answer that.
Yeah.
I mean, I would like to say that I would never take another person's life. You're asking me if I, as an imperfect human, had that moment right there. What would I do in that moment? I have no way of knowing that. My imperfect nature would likely lead me to press it, but I still think that at the end of the day, what God desires of me is to not do it. That he provides us with another path out of that. So
yeah. Well, and I'm asking because I'm trying to find, I need to ask questions. Let me put it in the form of a question.
Go ahead.
Which is that if there is no line, if there is no crime, if there is no criminal, if there is no good outcome for the death penalty, then in what way are you not prioritizing the rights of the criminal over the rights of the victim?
Sorry, could you repeat that question one more time?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if we refuse to ever use the harshest penalty in the hopes that it would deter crime and therefore protect innocent people, then why isn't that a preference for criminals over victims? I mean, there has to be some threshold where punishment of crimes does deter crime. I mean, surely we agree that there is some threshold out there, some proper execution of justice that does deter crime. And so my question is, if we take this off the table and we take this off the table, then at some point, if we get more crime as a result of taking deterrence off the table, then how are we not privileging criminals and violent people?
Well, I would say that I don't think we're privileging them necessarily by imprisoning them, by taking them away from society. I still feel like the argument is framed in a bit of a retributive perspective. Like if we don't say, hey, if you kill, then we're going to kill you. I think the Christian is called to something higher than that. I think that look, we can protect society without having to kill people. We can do this. We do have the ability to protect the world and take that criminal out of society without having to take their life.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's fine. Would you say that there are any justified uses of violence?
Any justified uses of violence broadly? I would say yes, and in fact, the theology that I subscribe to, my church teaching, recognizes that there are justified moments of violence.
Okay,
rare, pinpointed, but yes.
I mean, would you say, for example, prison is a form of violence?
I think that it certainly can be. It certainly can be. Yeah, but
okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I guess then, how far would you say that a Christian should go to help bring an end to violence? I mean, if we can agree that there is some level of violence that needs to be used to lessen violence against innocent people, have you thought how far you wouldn't go as far as the death penalty. That's fine. But you would, for example, go as far as life in prison. What is kind of your upper limit on the use of violence? And I don't mean beating someone up. I mean like imprisoning someone as a form of violence because you're restricting their movement, for example, right? So what's kind of, have you thought about like your upper limit to what we could do more, that what we Christians could do morally to bring an end to violence?
Well, I think that for the most part, a lot of violence comes from this desire to do so comes from a broken and darkened place. And so I think that if we as Christians are truly salt and light in this world and take our mission to evangelize properly and to do our best to bring people to the transformative power of Christ, then that in and of itself it's what we've been commanded to do, and it's what we should do. I do think that governments have to protect their society. I do think that we have to, there are situations where someone has to be restrained or restricted in some form or fashion in order to protect other innocent life. But I think it really comes down to what's ultimately in our hearts and what we desire of that person. I don't think that we should desire death for anybody. I think that what my pastor often says is that we're on the side of life. We're on the side of heaven, not the side of death and not the side of hell.
That was a timer, but I was going to let you finish your sentence, of course.
Okay.
Yes.
And any of this, I'm happy to also to bring up in our next discussion too, as we go on. But it's just real quick, as far as the threshold goes, I'm afraid the rest of what I want to say is going to be a little longer than the time we have now. So maybe best to just shift it over to the next part of our discussion.
That's fair. Okay. And keep in mind that if the magical question that he asked you about killing one guy and then you don't ever have murder again, I'll tell you one thing, it wouldn't happen. You wouldn't get the death penalty. So we'd all win. No, okay, let me stop. Okay, this is our final 10 minutes of cross, and Matthew, you're in the driver's seat. So whenever you're ready.
Okay. Do you think that the Christian has the prerogative to work towards and obtain peace in every situation?
The prerogative?
Well,
as in like the right or the duty to do that?
The duty.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to kind of pose the same question back to you again. Do you think that, I guess to go back to something I said earlier, if you don't, let me answer the same question. If you don't have to kill somebody, like if you don't have to kill them in order to protect, I'll say that for later, but if you don't have to kill somebody to protect society, if there is not an imminent threat of violence, why should we do it? Why should we kill?
I believe that justice is a transcendental property of the universe because it's a property of God. Justice itself calls for it. I agree that I'm answering you can make a pragmatic argument that it doesn't have to be done. I'm actually arguing, though, that justice demands it. So in that sense, it has to be done. And I think that's what God wants us to know about him. A lot of the Old Testament law, you could say, is arbitrary. I don't think it is, but you could say, for example, why not eat pig, right? Why not wear clothes with two mixed fabrics? Well, I think God is constantly instilling in us through the law this notion that he is holy and that he is to be obeyed and that there's a certain way that he wants us to live. And I think that his moral law and much of his civil law, by the way, is for all people at all times. I don't think that it stops, in Malachi. So I think justice itself simply calls for it. I think that what you have when we refuse to do that is a demoralization to such a degree that we're living through right now, where people see heinous crimes committed over and over and over again. I mean, every single day on my Twitter feed, I could pull up an example of a heinous crime where there is almost no penalty. And I believe that it is a demoralization campaign, if I'm being honest, where average people, in the name of kindness and compassion, are basically convinced that we ought not to punish criminals. And therefore, I think justice is not being done. And I think when justice is not being done, God is not honored. And we see more innocent people suffer. So, there's a cost to bear at either end of this. The cost I'm willing to pay is I might be too violent towards criminals. But I think on the other side, the cost to pay is there may be more innocent victims.
Our country has the longest and the strictest sentences of any developed nation right now, and yet we also have one of the higher crime rates. So we do have high crime across the nation, but we also our sentence lengths are longer. Our sentence the strictness of our sentences are greater. How does that match up with what you're saying about leniency? I mean, outside of the use of, and I'm in Alabama, we use the death penalty all the time in Alabama, and yet the murder rate in my town is skyrocketed. Same in Birmingham too. And Alabama's never shy about killing people on death row. Between the longest and strictest sentences that we have of any nation, with our sentence lengths being significantly longer than other places, how does that line up with what you're saying about being too lenient?
Yeah. Well, actually, earlier I thought you said that crime was actually reducing, and I wanted to maybe ask a question about that and cross, because I don't know that crime is reducing. I think that you see a lot of felonies pled out for misdemeanors, and things like that, or just crime is just not. It's just not. No, I mean, well under half the murders in this country are even solved. So I'm not sure to what degree we're actually going after criminals even. And then when we don't do that, we say, oh, crime is reduced. I'm sorry, give him more time because I didn't answer his question. It was, well, I guess the sentences still aren't long enough. It's like if you tell your kid, well, if you don't eat the broccoli, you're just not going to eat. And then, they cry and they go to bed hungry one night. Well, the next night they'll probably eat the broccoli, but if you give in the next night, right, and you say, well, okay, fine, you can have yogurt instead of broccoli. Well, they're not going to really learn their lesson. So I think that basically, whatever we're doing, I agree it's not working. And by the way, you can make a good argument against mass incarceration, and that might be a totally, we'd actually might agree on that. I actually do think we need a massive reform of our criminal system. I don't think people are being rehabilitated. I don't think there's enough Christian influence in our prisons. I think our prisons need to become explicitly Christian places where we preach the gospel, where we speak about, repentance and restoration. I believe in restorative justice. And yet, so I don't think that's what's happening. So I'm not an expert in crime. This is more of like a hearts and minds debate from my point of view, where I think that Christians ought to support the death penalty because God demands it and justice demands it.
And that's obviously going to be the big point where we disagree on the whole thing. I don't know. I get the quote, the beatings will continue until morale improves there. I mean, I don't know. At a certain point, I think we have to ask ourselves if we are, or would you, frame this as a question. If you think that the sentences aren't hard enough or not long enough, do we really believe that going even harsher is the right course of action? We're already being pretty harsh as it is, and so to get much harsher, we start stepping into some different territory. Do you not think that perhaps looking at more of a that maybe there's something else here? There's a different route here.
If I went back to the young lady killed on the train in Charlotte, North Carolina. Her attacker had been arrested 14 times. And then all these other stories come out about people who have been arrested dozens and dozens of times. Why are these people continually put on the streets to make innocent victims die or get hurt? I don't understand that theory of justice. It's not just at all. It favors one group of people, criminals, over another group of people, victims. And so, that person should not have been on the streets by any means. In fact, North Carolina, they had hearings about this, which did not go well for the city of Charlotte and the county, Mecklenburg County, I think it's called, where the people basically, they believe in what they call restorative justice, but what it really means is letting people out over and over. That's what cashless bail, that's what the debate about cashless bail is about, which is at the highest levels of our government. Donald Trump has mentioned cashless bail as a real problem in cities. You have the whole state of California voting to repeal that $950 threshold for shoplifting as a misdemeanor. One of the debates I hope we have in the future is on like the broken windows theory of justice versus, I don't know, the more lenient approach and which one works. So I do think that deterrence can work if it's taken seriously by the criminal. But if we continue, in fact, there was another tweet that went viral the other day, maybe a few weeks ago, like Matt Walsh talked about how only something like, I think it was 5 or 10% of people in America will ever be arrested. And of that 5% or so, like 1% account for the bulk of all the arrests. And so really, it really actually wouldn't be hard to solve the problem of crime because it's the same people doing it over and over again. And yet we keep letting them out to do it. And again, that victimizes people. We're stolen from, I'm in downtown Houston. I don't feel safe getting on the train. I don't feel safe walking in my neighborhood. Even when I go for a walk at night with my dog, I'm very aware of my surroundings. I'll just put it that way. And I'm ready and willing to defend myself. Let me put it that way as well. Because that's who Houston seems to be letting out. And so I just don't think the deterrents are there in spite of the data saying that we have longer sentences. I don't know.
You got time for another question?
Yes, because he took so long answering that question.
Yes.
I'm going to give you a few more seconds. Yeah.
Okay,
Please.
So again, I would have to say then, I feel like what you're bringing up points that I would agree with about, why is that person put back out on and on the streets of that nature? But is that not more of an argument about how our justice system should be reformed? Should we say instead that, this isn't working, so let's just kill them because then they can't get back on the street? Or instead, I feel like that kind of moves us into an argument more about other means of ensuring security. We can have that conversation all day, but I would say that that's not entirely the focus of this particular debate.
Yeah.
This particular debate is about should we support the death penalty. I've got lots to say about how the justice system operates outside of the death penalty. But I feel like, would you not say that as Christians who advocate for redemption, who should advocate for peace and follow that model of Christ, should we not look at different avenues to address the problems that you're bringing up other than just saying, it's not working, so let's kill them? Would you have other countries in this world that have lower crime rates and don't use the death penalty at all? So what is it that's making America different?
Well, that is a bigger topic to be clear. I think there's a certain homogeneity, as has been said, in certain countries that allows for people to be more at peace with one another. There's a shared culture that allows for that as well. But no, I don't think that it's just like, well, let's just kill them. I think that again, if I go back to my heads and freezer standard, I'm only saying that there ought to be some standard by which someone is worthy of the death penalty, if it provides other goods and it's in obedience to what God has said. But I think what has happened is a trickle down effect. So very few crimes that could earn the death penalty, like murder or rape or kidnapping, ever get the death penalty. Ever. It's less than 1%, because the moment somebody confesses to it, that the plea bargain is they get life in prison and so on. And so what has happened in our justice system, it seems to me, has been we've essentially taken the death penalty off the table. Even in Texas, it's like 25 years between the crime. We have people who committed crimes in the 90s getting executed now, So we've taken that off the table, and there's been a trickle down effect where we simply don't believe in, sufficient punishment to deter crime anymore. That's just my observation. I can't prove it, but I think that if we got back to a more biblical seriousness, when it came to crime, I think that actually would bring about more peace.
Okay. So, I think I can just do Evan's final remarks by saying heads and freezers bad. No. Okay, but we are to the point where we're going to do our closing remarks, and then we'll tackle some Q&A. So Evan, I'm putting 5 minutes on the clock, which is going to fly compared to all of that cross. Are you ready?
Yeah, hang on. I'm going to put 5 minutes on my phone here so I see it too. So I'll stop on time. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Matthew, thanks a lot. I really appreciate your spirit. I mean, I don't really want to be the guy defending death. I agree that Christians, we have a message of life. We have a message of resurrection. We have a message of forgiveness, redemption, hope. I believe in all of those things. Some people just don't like to play by the rules. And so when they don't play by the rules, the question is, well, what do we do? We can have all of the best wishes for those people in the world. And I think that we ought to try. I think we ought to try to rehabilitate. I think we ought to present the gospel to people on death row and people certainly not on death row. I've known prison chaplains. I'm sure you probably have known people who have done it's very difficult work, but people are changed. There are many people who come to Christ in prison, and for that I'm glad. I believe in that work, and that's a very good thing. I do think, though, that deterrence is very important. I think that's why God institutes the death penalty for a number of crimes. It's to lessen the need for the death penalty in the first place. It's sort of speak softly but carry a big stick sort of thing. Peace through strength. To use a foreign policy example. If you know something really bad is going to happen if you do this crime, and there's sufficient evidence that you've done this crime, then it'll prevent you doing that crime, which prevents a victim, and it prevents you getting the death penalty. But when we go soft on crime, it just encourages crime. It's almost like you're basically saying to criminals, it's okay to do crime. Paul says that the law is a tutor, and I agree. The law tells people how they ought to live, which is why if you legalize abortion, you get more abortion, because you're basically telling people that it's okay. I do want to mention this book again. It's a book by Joel McDermott. It's called The Bounds of Love, and basically it's one way of thinking about limits on the death penalty if you believe Old Testament law should carry into the New. Right. So I agree that what I'm arguing for is that Old Testament laws and penalties carry into the New Testament age in which we live, and that there are further difficult conversations we would have to draw where, let's say, we all did agree that heads and freezers gets you the death penalty. But what about kidnapping? What about a parent who has joint custody, but he keeps the child for a week longer? I mean, technically that's kidnapping, and in the Bible, kidnapping is a death penalty offense. So, we have to draw, or like abortion. That's part of the conversation going on now in the abolitionist camp is what is the penalty for abortion? We do believe, if we believe that women should be penalized for it, and if it's murdering a child, are we just taking the death penalty off the table for that? That's a pretty radical concept to a lot of people, but those are the kinds of questions that we need to ask if we do think the Old Testament law does still apply. And ultimately, that's kind of where I would go with this, is that I'm not trying to sound pious or silly or overly simplistic, but my answer to this sort of thing is that God says so. And I think that we're actually being obedient to God when we take seriously what he says about certain crimes and their penalties. And I think that one of the things among all the progressive Christians, that I know, this is one of the, core disagreements. It's not just, of course, the death penalty, but there's a whole host of issues where there end up being disagreements because where I think God has said a clear word about a certain thing, about a certain code of ethics, about a certain punishment for a certain behavior, the progressive often says, well, times are different now. Things have changed. And I think that's just a bad hermeneutic. I think also we can be both restorative and retributive. I don't think it's either or. I think it's a both and. I think that while people are in prison, we talk about separation of church and state, and this is where, the kind of Christian nationalist types, one of the things that I would say is that I would love to see our public prisons be explicitly Christian places. That's where we get the word penitentiary from, doing penance. Let's go back to that. I would love to see explicit, shameless promulgation of Christianity in our prisons, preaching the gospel and really working to bring about healing. Offering a chaplain, that's not really doing it. Letting them do drugs and learn how to be a better criminal, that's not going to do it. I think if you look at, for example, what El Salvador is doing and their rehabilitation programming in prison, it's pretty interesting. Finally, I'll say it's not that I desire the death of anyone, But when death has occurred, the question is, how do we honor the victim and future victims? And I think the death penalty is at least one way we do that.
All right at 5 minutes. Well done. All right, Matthew, the last word, or 5 minutes worth of words, whenever you're ready.
At the end of the day, for me, this is, it's not a difficult place to come to. Again, my nature as a human person wants to see people who do terrible things feel the pain that they have inflicted on other people. I freely admit that. But I'm imperfect, and I am of a fallen world, a world that where death originally was not meant for the human person, where death entered into this world because of man's sin. I think that's an important point that we have to remember, that death in general for the human person comes about because of sin. Through Christ, I believe with all of my heart that death is not only transformed, but we are transformed. We are offered a way outside of this use of violence in any situation to reach any kinds of redemption or justice or means to an end. I acknowledge that we read in the Old Testament that God has commanded these things in certain situations, in certain times. But as I said earlier, through Christ, all things are elevated. Through Christ, we see we see it differently. I would say that for me as the Christian person, I will always hold out hope for the redemption of others. I recognize that if God wishes to strike somebody down, he will do so. If the heavens open up and God says, this is what you have to do, we hear that voice. I understand that. But at the end of the day, when I model my life, or when I attempt to model my life off of Christ, I just don't see the recourse for the death penalty. When we talk about the victim being respected, and one of the things that Genesis 9:6 tells us is that we are all made, reminds us that we're made in the image and likeness of God, but so too is that person who has taken life. So too is that murderer. I feel that we respect that image of God, that we respect that sanctity by not taking that life, by instead saying, we've seen that you've done this terrible thing. We've seen that you've done something awful. And yet the hope of redemption is still open to you. We're not going to take your life. We're not going to do the same thing to you that you did to somebody else. We're going to pull ourselves out of that cycle of violence, and we are going to instead hope for your restoration, because that's what we want. Through Christ, all things are made different. Mm-hmm. And as the Christian person, as a Christian person, I recognize that this life is not the end, that death is not the end of me, that I am, there is more life, there is something else, there is something greater. I can't necessarily alleviate the suffering of the person, the family of the people of that person who's been murdered. I can't bring that person back to life. I can't restore their life. But what I do know is that I don't believe that balance or that justice necessitates that one life be taken because another one was taken. I believe that true justice, true balance is to see that person turn, recognize their sin, turn from that awfulness. If we can, if someone who puts heads in freezers can turn from that awfulness, though they may have sacrificed their right to live amongst human people for forever, if God tells me that person can turn from sin, that person can be redeemed, then I have to believe it. And it's not about what I want. It's not about what I feel is right. It's not about what I feel is what my fallen nature wants. It's what God wants. Now I understand, like we said a second ago, But at the end of the day, when I'm given the option, if I'm given the option, or if you're asking me as a Christian person who follows the model of Christ, should I kill this person, even if they did something heinous? I'm always going to say no. I'm always going to hold out hope for their redemption, hard as it may be. I'm going to do it imperfectly. I'm not going to do a very good job of it. But at the end of the day, that's what I have to remember. What is it that God wants of all of us? It's for all of us to be saved. What is it God wants for all of us? It's unity, not just unity on this earth, but perfect communion with him forever, to be united with his creation forever. And so for me, when I look at the world, that's my ultimate goal. That's what I'm going to move towards in all things.
All right. Well, here, we don't have a live audience, but I'll give you guys an applause for being gentlemanly and bringing some great points to the table. We're going to throw a few minutes on the timer for some Q&A. We have a couple questions from people from social media, from reaching out ahead of time. In the future, we might do this with a live audience, which would be fun. This is what we do at our Theology by the Pint events. But the first two questions, one of these is from Facebook, and the other one is from me, actually. And they're really similar, so I'm actually going to read them both. Sure. And then whoever wants to chime in, it's really probably more a question for Evan, but I want to hear from both of you. And Evan, you started to say something about this early in the conversation, but the first question says, the only thing that keeps me from supporting the death penalty in America in 2026 is the frequency with which our judicial system seems to get it wrong, right? Matthew talked about this. How would you suggest implementing it without risking killing innocent people? And the question that came in from someone else, very related on Facebook, she said, the use of DNA in court cases has shown so many innocent people who have been convicted that we should suspend the death penalty until we're sure that those who were convicted truly are guilty. It's not a question, it's a statement, but you see the question in there. Thoughts on that kind of thing? I think that's a lot of people's reservation.
Sure. Well, the same problem would have existed in ancient Israel. I am certain that there were people who were stoned to death incorrectly due to lying, bearing false witness of two witnesses, because that's usually the standard in the Bible for, conviction of a crime. Two witnesses need to say something. So but God knew that. And God still said, yes, but we should still have a death penalty. And the two witnesses is the best, solution that I've got at the, that God, gave at that moment. So I think that if someone wanted to say in the modern day, we need two witnesses, if you wanted to bring forth the two witnesses model, but you wanted to expand what a witness could be, I think that would be an interesting conversation. I would actually be quite interested in some, real heavy hitting theologians asking whether DNA is a witness, essentially, or if something like a ring camera is a witness. Would that fulfill a biblical mandate to put someone at the scene of a crime, for example? So I think we have many protections, to be honest. I mean, I'm not denying that there are people who have been imprisoned on false grounds and executed on false grounds. What I would say, though, is that there are many protections against that. Most of all, the burden is on the prosecution. Everyone is entitled to a defense. Evidence is brought to bear to a jury of one's peers. That's why when I get a jury summons, I try to get on a jury. I don't try to get out of it. I think I really believe it is a duty to try to serve on a jury, because I know if my life was in someone's hands, whether if it's for a traffic violation or a murder, I would want someone to give me a fair shake, so, and be intelligent enough to assess the evidence. So I think my argument would be that God knew that potential exists. It's an imperfect world. And yet if we take off possible penalties because we'll get it wrong, then there would be no penalty.
Yeah. I have a question for Matthew, piggybacking on that, but I do just want to clarify for our audience. When you talk about two witnesses, you're talking about two witnesses where they are under the same potential penalty if they are shown to be lying. Right. Okay.
So if a witness accuses someone of a crime that merits the death penalty, and it's a false, they bear false witness, then they get that punishment in return. Yeah. I actually think that we should really reconsider that, because we live in an era of false accusations with seemingly no penalty at all. And I think that's a real problem as well. And there was lots of talk a few years ago about, kind of a rape crisis when college, and the pushback was, well, but yeah, it's also bad to falsely accuse somebody of such a heinous act. I mean, like the Duke lacrosse case, for example, brought that sort of thing to the fore. So there should be a penalty for false accusations.
So, Matthew, am I correct in assuming that even if we could somehow ensure that we never got it wrong, you still would not support the death penalty?
No, I'm a veto. No, yeah. Because it's still taking a life, and that's the ultimate thing for me. Is I do think. Were you asking me to expand on that, or were you just asking yes or no?
Sure. I mean, the question was for Evan, but I didn't. That would be the way for you to chime in there, right?
Yeah. If is a big if right there, because
it's a magical world. Yeah.
There's not a way that we can do this, so we do have to contend with reality, and I do think that it has to be considered that even in the modern day. With all of the things that we can do, and we still get it wrong sometimes. And I would kind of go back to what I was saying earlier. Is I strongly believe that if you do not have to kill to protect from an imminent threat of violence, like if you don't have to use that to protect from an imminent threat, then what reason is there to do so in the first place? And this is especially true when it comes to the potential for error. But it's not just for me. The concern for me is not just whether or not we miss some evidence here or miss some things like that. I mean, like when you talk about cases like this, there's all kinds of bias that comes into it. I mean, racial prejudice has played a huge role in this in years past. I know that there's, cases about, of Black people being wrongfully executed or lynch mobbed or whatever for crimes that they never committed, or receiving an unfair trial. And so I think that the concerns about getting it wrong, because if we don't have to kill somebody, right? If we can, because I argue, and I'm going to continue to argue that we can protect society from the violent criminal. And without having to take their life. And if we can do that, if we have that option available to us, and yet we still determine it necessary to kill somebody or to take their life through the death penalty, the fact that there is the potential that we could get that wrong is severely concerning to me. I think that I do think that if we do take the life of an innocent person, we can't just go, oh, well, dang, that wasn't good. We shouldn't have done that. But next time we'll get it right.
Yeah.
We can't. And I'm not saying that's what you're saying, Pastor Evan, of course.
Yeah.
But I do think it's something that we have to consider. I mean, if we execute an innocent person, in my opinion, that's a great sin.
Sure.
And so I think it's a worthy reservation, and it's from a pragmatic perspective. I think it's we have to recognize human folly and human error, and when human folly and human error could result in the death of another person, especially potentially an innocent person, I think that we've got to look at a different path towards justice or whatever it is that we need to do.
I'm going to move us on. So the next question, I admit I don't quite understood. This question came on social media. I'm going to ask it to you guys. If one of you understands kind of what this person's getting at and you want to give it a stab, great. If not, we'll just move on to the next one. It says, if we are to trust in the governing authorities that have put the death penalty in place, should we trust that the penalty of death for a crime is just? I think maybe the person's saying, like, if we trust who we put in office, should we just but I'll ask it one more time, and you guys see if you can figure out what they're asking. If we are to trust in the governing authorities that have put the death penalty in place, should we trust that the penalty of death for a crime is just?
I think it's like this. As a pastor, you trust me to, counsel you in difficult times, preach the gospel, administer the sacraments, but you won't let me have say on the budget. It's like you'll trust me with the important thing, but you won't trust me with the, the pragmatic thing. I think that's kind of what is being said is like, well, we elected these people, so we trust them with tax policy, military policy, immigration policy, et cetera, et cetera. Why wouldn't we also trust them with this? I think that is kind of preempting the argument that you can't trust the government to get it right, I guess, or you can't trust the system to get it right. So I think that's what's being said. And I guess I would. I mean, I don't want to sit here and defend the government by any means. I think the government gets a lot wrong. I think the justice system gets a lot wrong. I mean, it's going to be a very imperfect system. I'm kind of in a hearts and minds posture on this debate, which is, should Christians defend this? Create any scenario you want. Is there any justification for it ever being used because justice demands it, because God says so? That's where I come down. Whether or not it's executed, if you will, perfectly or not, I just take that off the table, because it's never going to be executed perfectly, and it wasn't in ancient Israel either.
Matthew, did you want to throw anything in there, or do you feel like that? I kind of get what he's saying, and to be quite frank, honestly, I mean, I do kind of agree with what Pastor Evan is saying here. But we also have to, there's plenty of situations where you've got someone who says, well, I voted for that guy and he didn't win, so I don't trust the guy that did win. And so I think that, should you trust the government to implement the death penalty properly? I'm gonna borrow a line from you. I don't think that one. For me personally, the fact that they can get it wrong is just another reason to not support it. But my God, if we're gonna sit here and start talking about every instance of human folly and how it can affect things, we'll be here all night. But so I would say that I don't know that it super duper matters, because just like Pastor Evan is saying, I'm stout in my conviction that regardless of the situation, we shouldn't be taking any more life, at least not through the use of capital punishment. Whether it can be done justly or not, it doesn't.
Let me kind of steelman the position, or maybe take the alternative view, which is something like, well, if you empower the government to kill people that do really bad things, what happens in the future if they start to expand who they kill, right? So now it goes from murderers, and now it's kidnappers, and now it's people who possess certain things on their internet, and now it's people who say certain things, and now it's Christians, and so I think it's a slippery slope argument. Slippery slopes are real, by the way. It's not just a fallacy. So, that could be a pretty good argument, that basically, today they might not come for you, but later they will. So be careful what you wish for, sort of thing. And, so I am hoping that Christians will have an continued, presence and influence on the culture, and both in terms of grace and truth, both in terms of our promulgation of the gospel and the freedom that brings, but also the law of God that brings about a more just society.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping I don't live in a Soviet future where I go to a gulag. Yeah.
Well, try not to put any heads in freezers, and that'll be a good start. Sorry, that's just going to be.
By the way, it is said that Jeffrey Dahmer did convert to Christianity in prison. There's some debate about that, but there was a chaplain that said so. See,
I saw the Netflix special. I'm up to it.
Yeah. I kind of wish I didn't, but I did. See that as well, and it's like, well, so that's. Even the worst guy had enough time to find Jesus in prison, Yeah.
And if he'd had the death penalty, maybe he wouldn't have, Evan. Okay. Matthew, you mentioned you might have a question or two from some folks on your end. Do you want to bust one of those out before I do our last one?
I think most of the ones that we have received have already been discussed.
Kind of addressed.
Yeah, we've hit on that quite a bit. Let me, if you'll forgive me for just a second, let me scroll back here through and see. Well,
I can also just ask the last question that we have, and Evan can start.
Looking at the two that I have, and it feels like we've discussed these. We would be being redundant.
Okay. This last one is a little bit longer, but I thought it was intriguing, and it's along the same lines of some of the other stuff that we talked about, but they put the question in, so I think we should ask it. Person says, most states that enforce the death penalty now use lethal injection, but I've also heard that that's an awful way to die. Autopsies of executed inmates reveal evidence of severe pulmonary edema, that's fluid in the lungs, which is a condition that induces a feeling of choking, drowning in one's own fluids, suffocating, being buried alive, and a burning sensation. Federal judges have compared this experience to the torture tactic of waterboarding. How can Christians support this kind of cruelty? Evan, obviously,
I don't know that Christians have to support every possible method of the death penalty. I'm actually a fan of the firing squad myself. I don't know why we got away from it. States are actually, I think Utah's going back to it. I think it was brought up with Charlie Kirk's, assassin trial that firing squad is a possibility in that case. So I think that the death should be quick and painless. And I think there are ways to guarantee anonymity or guarantee a lack of culpability. And that's usually done. Like, for example, if somebody pushes a button to do the lethal injection or something, then nobody really knows. There'll be 5 people pushing buttons and only one of them actually injects the fluid, right? So there are ways in which people, no one wants to be sort of on the hook for actually having to kill the person. But yeah, I agree with that. I think it's weird that we like invent new ways to kill people. I don't actually understand that. I don't. Why do we need to electrocute somebody, for example? There are horror stories about that. I have no clue why we don't just shoot somebody. At this point, Matthew's like, man, this guy's really dark. But I think it's merciful.
All his life choices that led to this moment. Yeah,
it's merciful to put someone out of their misery. Like, I agree. It shouldn't be cruel, any more cruel than death is. So,
yeah. Anything you want to add to that, Matthew? I'm sure you agree with that.
Yeah. We shouldn't support it. That's what I would say. And I mean, I guess you could argue that heinous or painful means is another notch in the wall for me there. But again, I mean, it doesn't really change my overall point that painless or not, we're still taking a life, and it's something that I remain staunchly opposed to.
Yeah. Well, hopefully next time we do one of these debates, we'll have more and more questions coming in from maybe even a live studio audience. But until such a time, I just want to thank you guys both for doing this and being so gracious with each other and thought-provoking. And thank you to, of course, listeners and those that did put questions in. Remember, of course, to check out the websites. flhouston.org is First Lutheran, and then theologybythepint.org is where you can send all kinds of notes. What did you like? What didn't you like? What do you want to hear about in the future? And of course, if you want to get in touch with Matthew, you can get in touch with us, and we'll put you in touch with him if you seem nice enough. And
he doesn't have any social media, so that's why we haven't. Otherwise, I would promote your social media, Matthew. I just want, in case listeners are wondering, like if we're being petty or something. But if you do you have a way you want to let, if people want to email you or something?
I have an email address. I'd be happy to, is there, it's kind of long because my name was taken, so I had to add stuff to it. Can I send it to you and have you put it out that way with this?
Sure. So we can put it in the notes or something if you're okay with that.
I can just text it to you when we're done.
Okay.
Well, and of course, if you go to theologybythepint.org, which is, my baby, so I'm going to tell people to go there, you can get in touch with me or Evan there just by filling out the little contact card, and we can get you Matthew's information. But watch, on social media for these in the future. Subscribe to us on YouTube so that you'll see these come in and be able to listen and engage with us. Thank you for joining us, and good night.